Richard Wallace sat in his corner office, sipping an expensive cup of coffee. His desk was spotless, his suit perfectly pressed, and his expression unreadable. From the outside, he looked like a man in control, powerful, successful, untouchable. But inside, his company was crumbling. Wallace Tech had once been an industry leader, a giant in the world of technology. But times were changing, and Wallace refused to change with them. While competitors embraced innovation, he clung to his old ways. His leadership style was outdated, his business decisions reckless. He ran the company like a dictator, ignoring advice, dismissing concerns, and making decisions based on personal bias rather than strategy. His employees feared him. No one dared to question him, no one challenged his authority. Those who tried didn't last long. Wallace believed loyalty meant obedience, and talent meant nothing if he didn't personally approve of someone. Behind the scenes, the company was bleeding money. Investors were pulling out, profits were shrinking, and customers were leaving for better alternatives. But Wallace refused to see the truth. He blamed the market, the economy, anything but himself. His biggest flaw? He judged people based on their looks, not their abilities. In his mind, success had a certain image, a specific type of person. If you didn't fit that image, you had no place in his company. It didn't matter how skilled or experienced you were. Wallace made snap judgments the moment someone walked into his office. Today, he would make one of the biggest mistakes of his life, but he didn't know it yet. David Carter sat outside the Wallace Tech headquarters, taking a deep breath. He had prepared for this moment. His resume was impeccable. Multiple degrees, years of experience in tech startups, and a sharp business mind. He wasn't just qualified for the job. He was overqualified. But David wasn't the type to walk in with arrogance. He believed in proving himself. That's why, instead of starting his own company right away, he wanted hands-on experience in an established firm. Wallace Tech had once been a leader in the industry, and he saw potential in it. With his portfolio in hand, David walked into the lobby. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "You're here for the management position, right?" "Yes," David said, nodding. "David Carter." She glanced at his resume and raised an eyebrow. "Impressive background," she murmured, before motioning toward the elevator. "Third floor, last office on the right. Good luck." David walked into Richard Wallace's office with confidence, but the moment Wallace looked up at him, his expression changed. It was subtle, just a flicker of disinterest, the way his eyes skimmed over David without truly seeing him. Wallace took the resume and barely glanced at it. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the desk. "So, David," he said, his tone neutral, "tell me why you think you're a good fit for this company." David began explaining his experience, his skills, his ideas for growth, but Wallace wasn't listening. He nodded occasionally, but his eyes remained cold. After barely 2 minutes, Wallace set the resume down. "I don't think you'd be a good fit here," he said. David blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" Wallace's voice was smooth, emotionless. "We're looking for someone with a stronger background, someone who fits our company culture." David knew what that meant. He had heard it before, in different ways, from different people. It wasn't about qualifications. It wasn't about experience. It was about an image Wallace had in his head. David stayed silent for a moment, letting the words settle. He could argue. He could demand an explanation. But what would be the point? Wallace had already made up his mind before David had even spoken. So instead, David simply stood. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Wallace," he said calmly. Wallace barely nodded in response, already looking at his computer screen as if the conversation had never happened. As David walked out, he noticed the receptionist watching him. There was something in her expression: disappointment, frustration. She had seen it too. David left the building, his resume still in hand. The rejection stung, but it didn't break him. If anything, it only fueled him. What Wallace didn't know was that he had just turned away the man who would soon own everything he had worked for. Richard Wallace leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Another day, another tough decision. He had turned down 5 applicants that morning alone. To him, it was all part of the job, separating the worthy from the unworthy. He prided himself on his ability to spot the right kind of talent, but what he failed to realize was that his company was dying. Behind closed doors, his top investors were growing restless. The company's stock had been declining for months, and Wallace's refusal to adapt was driving them away. At an emergency meeting, James Sinclair, one of Wallace Tech's largest investors, sat across from Wallace with a serious expression. "Richard," he began, "we need to talk about the company's future." Wallace smirked. "Oh, don't tell me you're worried, James." "I am," Sinclair replied. "And so are the others." He placed a file on the table, sliding it toward Wallace. "Sales are down 30% this quarter. Investors are pulling out. Your competitors are gaining ground." Wallace waved a hand dismissively. "It's just a temporary slump. These things happen." Sinclair leaned forward. "No, Richard, it's not temporary. The industry is changing, and you refuse to change with it. Companies that embrace diversity and fresh talent are thriving. Meanwhile, you keep rejecting promising candidates because of outdated thinking." Wallace scoffed. "Don't lecture me about running a business, James. I built this company from the ground up." "And you're about to run it into the ground," Sinclair shot back. The tension in the room was thick, but Wallace remained stubborn. "Wallace Tech doesn't need to modernize. We need loyal employees who understand our culture." Sinclair sighed, shaking his head. "If you don't evolve, this company won't survive. Mark my words." But Wallace didn't listen. A company in decline. Meanwhile, his employees were miserable. Morale was at an all-time low. Talented workers were leaving in droves to join companies that valued innovation and inclusivity. Productivity was stalling. New ideas were ignored. Wallace dismissed concerns with a simple wave of his hand, confident in his own decisions. Meanwhile, the competition was thriving. Younger, smarter companies were rising, led by forward-thinking CEOs who valued diverse teams and new ideas. Wallace? He was still stuck in his ways, rejecting candidates based on personal biases rather than skill. And then, the final blow came. David Carter hadn't wasted a second dwelling on his rejection. Instead, he turned it into fuel. Building his own empire. With his experience, connections, and vision, he launched his own tech startup. It started small, but David knew exactly what he was doing. Unlike Wallace, he hired the best people, regardless of background. His company was built on innovation, collaboration, and diversity. Investors noticed. One day, at a networking event, David found himself speaking with James Sinclair. Sinclair, already frustrated with Wallace Tech's decline, was impressed by David's business acumen. "You've got something special here," Sinclair said after hearing David's pitch. David smiled. "I believe the future belongs to those who embrace change." Sinclair nodded. "I agree. I've been watching Wallace Tech fall apart for years. If Wallace doesn't change, he's going to lose everything." David leaned in slightly. "And if that happens, would you be willing to invest in something new?" A slow smile spread across Sinclair's face. "Let's talk." David's meteoric rise. With Sinclair's backing, David's startup exploded in growth. Over the next 2 years, his company grew into a major player in the tech industry. Meanwhile, Wallace Tech continued to crumble. Investors were bailing, profits were vanishing, employees were fleeing. Wallace remained in denial until it was too late. One morning, he woke up to a nightmare. The perfect opportunity. Investors, desperate to save their money, were looking for someone to buy Wallace Tech. And David Carter was ready. One meeting, one decision, and the deal was sealed. David now owned a controlling stake in Wallace Tech. Richard Wallace had no idea what was coming. Richard Wallace had always been a man of routine. Every morning, he woke up in his sprawling penthouse, sipped his black coffee, and read the business news. Today, as he scrolled through his phone, his blood ran cold. The headline was everywhere. Wallace Tech acquired by rising tech giant Carter Innovations. Wallace blinked, rereading the words, his stomach tightening. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw the name. David Carter. The man he had dismissed. The man he had written off. He grabbed his phone, dialing his assistant. "Get my car ready, now." He raced to his office, his mind spinning. This had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. There was no way some nobody had just bought his company. But as he stormed into the building, employees whispered, their eyes filled with shock and curiosity. Some even smiled. Wallace ignored them and burst into the boardroom. The room was silent. At the head of the table sat a familiar face. David Carter, calm, collected, sitting in his chair. Wallace's breath came in short bursts. "What the hell is going on?" David leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I own Wallace Tech now," he said simply. Wallace's hands curled into fists. "You! You can't be serious! This is my company!" David tilted his head. "It was." Wallace turned to the board members. "You let this happen? After everything I've done for this company?" One of them, an older man, sighed. "Richard, we didn't have a choice. The company was failing. Investors wanted out. David offered them a way forward." Wallace shook his head violently. "No, no, I built this empire." David studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small smirk, he said the words Wallace would never forget. "You told me I wasn't a good fit for this company, but it looks like I own it now." Silence. Wallace staggered back, his face pale. It was over. The board voted unanimously. Wallace was officially removed as CEO. He turned to David, desperate now. "This company is everything to me," he whispered. "You can't do this. Please, just let me stay." David said nothing. Just like Wallace had done during their first meeting, security arrived. Wallace had no choice but to leave. For the first time in his life, he had lost. The next morning, Wallace Tech was reborn. The first order of business? Change. David revamped the entire leadership team, bringing in fresh talent, innovative thinkers, and people chosen for their skills, not their background. Employees who had lived in fear under Wallace now felt heard. Morale soared, creativity flourished, investors returned. Under David's leadership, Wallace Tech, now rebranded as Carter Innovations, became a dominant force in the industry. And Wallace? He faded into irrelevance. The man who once ruled an empire now sat alone, his name a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, David Carter proved what true leadership looked like: vision, talent, and integrity. And he had done it without ever needing Wallace's approval.